This is ogforums.com Real Talk, an unfiltered, independent perspective on Acumatica Cloud ERP. My name is Tim Rodman, and I want to mention three things in this pre-recorded intro before we get started. First, thank you to our sponsors. Our first sponsor is Paya. Paya offers Acumatica users a suite of industry-leading payment orchestration tools. Far beyond native Acumatica payments, Paya enables EMV NFC terminals for countersale. They offer a frictionless customer portal through their click-to-pay solution, and they support most e-commerce platforms and point-of-sale solutions used with Acumatica, such as One Retail and AcuPOS. And best of all, omni-channel reconciliation is available for all their solutions. Our second sponsor is DataSelf. DataSelf Analytics is a revolutionary reporting solution that enables organizations to make the most informed decisions faster and easier than ever. It uniquely simplifies business intelligence, empowers anyone to build and access dashboards, and delivers critical business insight when and where you need it. Our third sponsor is Aldrich Web Solutions. Are you a distributor using Acumatica, yet struggling with an e-commerce fit? US-based Aldrich Web Solutions out of Marion, Illinois, has 2 decades of experience helping distributors find success online. Our team of experts built the integration, creating websites that work effortlessly with Acumatica. With our reputation for swift customer service and meticulous attention to detail, we are the perfect fit for distributors needing online solutions. Please take a minute to support this podcast by clicking each one of the sponsor banners located at augforums.com/sponsors. Our sponsors track clicks, and every click helps to support this podcast. The second thing I'd like to mention is that I'm always looking for victims. I mean guests. If you use Acumatica in any capacity, no matter how small, I'd love to talk with you. Check out augforums.com/podcast and click the link near the top of the page to learn more about being a guest on the podcast. Third and finally, I'd love to see you listed on my Rolodex. Check out augforums.com/Rolodex to find out who else is using Acumatica and read the instructions at the top to see how you can add yourself to the list. All right, that's it for the pre-recorded intro. Let's get started. Today is Friday, October 18th, 2024, and this is episode number 141. You can find related links on the episode page at augforums.com/episode 141. Today I'm talking with Richard Cushing to reflect on a career in Midmarket ERP. Richard, thanks for coming out of semi-retirement to jump on this podcast episode.
Well, yes. Well, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm sorry it took so many months to get it coordinated.
Oh, no problem at all. I always like to start off with the brief origin story of all of our guests. And, in this case, we're going to kind of talk about a lot of that journey also, but maybe you could just sort of set the stage by telling us where you grew up, where you went to school, and how you landed in the world of Midmarket ERP.
Okay. Well, I was born in Nebraska and grew up in western South Dakota, not far from Rapid City, just outside the Black Hills, actually about halfway between the Black Hills and the Badlands in western South Dakota. And graduated from high school there, moved to Minnesota to go to the University of Minnesota, married my wife, and probably because we got an early start, I never completed my college career, and We have had 55 years together, and we've had 9 children. So we've had a busy career in that regard. Then somehow, when energy costs and inflation was so bad in the late 70s and early 80s, a friend of ours that we had met in northern Minnesota but was a native of El Paso, Texas, invited us to come down there because at that time, because of energy costs surging, the 3 fastest growing cities in the United States were all in Texas. So we moved to El Paso, Texas, and ended up spending 12 and a half years there. I had actually started a very small construction company in northern Minnesota, but it wasn't doing well in the economic climate. So moved to Texas, and I looked for a job in the construction industry, and ended up going to work for an established builder developer there. I worked for that company for 7 years, became a vice president in the company. Then when I left that company, I started doing a little consulting in the field of construction, and ended up being hired by one of my clients, and became a vice president in a highway, heavy, and utility construction company for a few years. And it was during that time, the late 70s and early 80s, or actually by that time it was the mid 80s, and the PC had been introduced in the meantime, and more small businesses were beginning to try to use PCs for accounting primarily. I also ended up helping people use systems for estimating and other purposes. But what happened is that I kind of naturally migrated out of construction and into helping businesses with their computer systems, because I found I had just sort of a natural knack for catching on how to do that. And I did take some training in some various software solutions that were available at that time. But it became a sort of a natural migration, because for the first probably 3 years of my consulting career, almost all my clients were people who knew me from the construction industry and just wanted me to help them get started with using computers in their business enterprises. So that's how I kind of migrated into the field and out of construction.
So it sounds like you kind of migrated into Midmarket ERP directly into a consulting capacity rather than, say, like working on an implementation of a software product at the company you were working for full time. Is that right?
Well, yes and no. The company I was working for at the time did buy a system, but it certainly wouldn't have qualified as an ERP. It was just basically a very simple accounting system, and I helped them a little bit getting started with that. And probably my first experience with what would have been a rudimentary ERP system at the time, if you wanted to call it that, would have been an implementation of a Great Plains accounting system in a window manufacturer and supplier, and so that was really my first contact with sort of an ERP implementation. Although they didn't use the term ERP that time, they just called it an accounting system with with some basic manufacturing and inventory elements added.
Gotcha. I'm going to try really hard to stay out of super technical stuff because I love diving into that. But if we do that, like you said, Great Plains, and Microsoft just announced that Great Plains is finally going to end in, I don't know, 5 years, something like that. Anyways, I'd love to chat about that, but I'm going to try really hard to pull myself out of that because, for me, the target of this episode is that a younger ERP consultant, which has become much more of a mainstream and accepted type of career path now, I think. And so, that's part, I'm kind of aiming at that audience. And so
Mm-hmm.
I guess one of the first things I wanted to ask you, independent of software, but with I didn't even realize you had the construction background. I would like to dive in a little bit and talk about the supply chain stuff that you've done, but
Sure.
just first off, just kind of broad across all the different things you've implemented. It's always been my impression that implementing software, business software specifically in an organization, the challenges that you run into are typically more to do with people than they are with technology. But I wanted to get your take on that. Did you find that to be the case in your career?
Um, well, yeah, I think there are always challenges with people in the implementation of anything that changes the way they do things until they become satisfied that the change is actually in their benefit, not merely in the company's benefit. Um, and so, yeah, there are certainly people challenges, but in the early days, there certainly were challenges with on the technology side as well, primarily because um, many products were pushed out to try to get some money back from the marketplace, sometimes before the products were really ready to be in prime time and used on a daily basis. So there were challenges on the technology side.
That makes sense. Yeah, I guess um, if you go back over the last 40 years, since a lot of the packages appeared in the 1980s, would you say that that has sort of changed? Like if you then fast forward to now where you've got a lot of cloud packages, or even if they're not officially cloud, they're fairly easy deployable. Like, would you say that that has changed? Things are a lot less about the installation and the hardware and those types of challenges, and more about configuration and how do we deploy this thing in the organization?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. Um, the challenges have moved from uh, how can we get the most out of a very limited package uh, to the many of the software offerings today have so much flexibility that it becomes a matter of understanding the business and especially the flow within the business to configure it in order to make the organization uh, work as effectively as possible at achieving its goals, because there are so many options, not only in terms of product options, that is, the various modules that can be purchased and applied, but also the configuration options within the module can make huge differences in how they perform within any given enterprise.
Yeah, and when you're sitting down, especially on a new implementation, let's take a just a more modern mid-market ERP package. Could be a Sage product, could be the Acumatica one that this audience is talking about, could be uh, Microsoft's Dynamics 365. When you're sitting down with one of those products that has a lot of features and how you configure it makes a big difference. What's your what did you find to be more successful? Like, was it um, really sit down and spend a lot of time on the whiteboard to really walk through how this thing would work, or get people into some type of demo environment sooner so that they could play with it? I feel like it's sort of two sides and you meet in the middle somewhere, but I don't know if that makes sense. What was your experience, how you actually get there instead of just remaining in the realm of theory the whole time?
Well, for me, uh, a lot of companies wanted to, um, they felt like spending a lot of time in pre-planning and that kind of thing was a waste of their time and their money. Sometimes that was feelings on the individual basis, the people sitting in the room with you, and sometimes it was a feeling of management saying we don't want to spend the money on this. We want to get right to frying the eggs or whatever. And um, but it was my job, I felt, to convince them that the time spent in understanding how the organization would operate within the context of the available options of the software would be time uh, easily regained and money saved in time wasted because or not, I should say, in time not wasted by doing things like setting up an irreversible configuration wrong and either having to live with it for the foreseeable future, or having to go back 3 steps and changing that configuration, because some things, once you get started with them, it simply is not that easy to flip a switch and say, let's do it a different way. It actually means backing up and going back to a backup maybe made 2 weeks prior in the conference room pilot or whatever, and saying, yeah, we need to change this configuration or it's not going to work for us, and that gets very expensive very fast.
And so, your advice to someone who's maybe in their late 20s, landed at a VAR implementing Acumatica specifically for this audience.
Mm-hmm.
And, ideally they'd have someone more seasoned to pull into the room who has more experience than anyone else in the room to make that case. But I think a lot of times that's just not the situation. And what would your advice be to someone in their, say, late 20s who is in a room full of people who are more experienced than they are? How would they make that case? How long should they spend trying to make that case, or is there a way to sneak in making that case elsewhere? Do you have any advice there?
Well, there's no easy answer to that because, first of all, there are very few good substitutes for experience. And um, being, I was fortunate that when I got into the industry, there weren't that many experienced people in the industry, so I could almost say I had more experience than just about anybody else that was in the room.
That's a
Uh,
good point because it was
that
such a brand new thing.
right, that's not necessarily the case today. So um, it really, um, if you can dig out some case studies or some, I mean, certainly were articles published about ERP failures and dig out the reasons for those failures and present them, 2 or 3 of them in a simple outline of, here's what happens, here's why it went wrong, and here's what it cost to fix it, or at least some approximation, whether that cost is in time or dollars or however it's stated. But um, but leveraging the experience of others, whether it's found in trade publications or whatever, can certainly help make the case for spending more time in planning in order to gain that benefit more rapidly in the later stages of implementation.
And sometimes I feel like you're just sort of, as a consultant, you're kind of riding a bucking bronco in terms of it's the organization is going to do what they're going to do, right? You only have so much that you can really influence, and so maybe to a certain extent you're just riding the bucking bronco where it takes you, and you just have to kind of go with it and work with what you have. But you feel that's the case also?
Well, yeah, in some cases, the management is adamant, uh, perhaps because they're being pressed financially, and they simply don't feel like they have the money to spend in in doing things right. So then the best thing you can do is to make the best of a poor situation, and do your best to warn them whenever you see warning signs. And I guess in what is, at least before I left it, becoming an increasingly litigious society, putting those warnings in writing is is very helpful.
That's great advice. Yeah, just sending off that email that calls out what you're seeing. And I like a book I read a while back called Flawless Consulting, by Peter Block,
Yep.
and he points out the need to be able to point out things that are difficult. I'm totally paraphrasing here,
Right.
but point it out in a non-emotional way, and that's difficult to do. But point it out as objectively as possible, and I like your point. Get it in writing so that you can always go back to it.
Right. Yeah. It's. I think it becomes imperative. Not that it always solves the problem, because you can have it in writing, but it can be misconstrued or intentionally misconstrued by by parties who didn't want to hear that advice in the first place.
Sure. Yeah, it's not a replacement for verbal communication. It's a supplement and a fallback when
Right.
things go bad, right? What about, you said earlier, it really jumped out at me. You talked about people don't change until they, correct, I'm paraphrasing this as well. They don't change until they see the benefit to them personally, not just the benefit to the organization. And, this is a internal debate I've had with myself. I'm much more of a carrot person than a stick person.
Mm-hmm.
Just I have that natural inclination. But I've always wondered, is there a place for the stick in a consultant's role implementing in an organization? I don't see it personally, but it could be just totally my personal bias. And your comment there sounded a lot more like a carrot approach than a stick approach. But have you ever found, what are your thoughts on that, carrot versus stick? And if you've ever found as a consultant that the stick can be used and in what situations?
Well, I guess my opinion and my experience has been that consultants don't very often have a very big stick. They
If one at all, right?
Yeah, they don't have the leverage to enforce change. But if you've read Peter Block's work and others, you know that oftentimes you'll go into an organization and everybody is stuck on this thing that people hate change. Management will say, "Well, our people all hate change," and I might just ask a simple question. How many in this room are married? Because chances are the majority are going to raise their hand. And I said, then, well, wasn't marriage a big change for you? And were you really not looking forward to that change because it was such a huge change in your life? I said, people don't hate change. What they hate is being pushed into a change for which they have not yet recognized any benefit for themselves personally. If you can, that's one of the reasons I think a conference room pilot, especially an extended conference room pilot, can be very beneficial to bring people into the organization, bring people in the organization into the realm where they are endorsing what's going on because they have already experienced in the conference room pilot how this is going to make their lives better in some way or other. Not simply the organization gaining from it, but they also, in their personal responsibilities within the organization, will gain from applying this software in a beneficial way.
I think it's interesting in the same context of talking about if you've studied Peter Block's work, you then talk about how you responded to that challenge with a question. And I've read the Flawless Consulting book by Peter Block. I haven't read the answer to why.
Is how.
The answer to how is
Or,
yes, I think, or something like that. I haven't read that book yet, and it almost sounds like you just did that in a sense, because I think his main point in that book, I think, is that you need to learn how to ask better questions, and in what situation would you say that that's what just happened right there when you use that example?
Yeah, the I think one of the things that Block writes, and I can't remember which book it was in, but it really made an impact on me, and that is if somebody asks 3 times how to do something, then it's not because they can't learn how to do it. It's because they don't know the why to doing it. They have no incentive to learning how to do it because they don't know the why for doing it. And so, if you run into resistance in an organization and people are repeatedly failing at accomplishing something because they claim they don't know how to do it yet, chances are they don't understand why they're doing it yet. Because once they understand why, and that why is a positive for them, in other words, it's not just, well, because we said so, but they're actually gaining something either through the organization or individually by doing it in this way and doing it properly, then the hows will go away.
I love it. Yeah, I learned about the Peter Block in general from Ed Kless, who worked at Sage for a number of years.
Yeah.
I took a consulting class that he gave, I don't know, 15 years ago, something like that. And he gave an example of that from his career, which was implementing an ERP system, and there was one particular lady who kept asking like how to do something that was very simple, and it was exactly that situation. Like it was the same thing. She kept forgetting how to do it, and eventually, he just kind of sat down and was like, I know you're a smart person. Like, why? I think you can get this. And basically, the answer was, you're right. I was really hoping to retire without ever having to learn computers or something
Right.
like that,
Yeah.
And so he got to the real issue behind that, right? And then you can talk about the real issue rather than just being focused on the how to do something. And if you just focus on that, it does seem like no one likes to change, and our organization is just stuck in their ways, et cetera. But there's something behind it, right? And it's, you got to find out what that is, and at least be able to talk about it. And then what you do about it is another question, right? But at least you've found the real issue and not the technical presentation of the issue, right?
Right. Yeah, that's pretty much the thrust of the book. The answer to how is why. um, I found it interesting. Somebody gave this example probably about that same time. Maybe it was even Ed. I'm not sure, but gave this example that people don't generally know this, but one of the last group of professionals to have telephones installed in their offices was attorneys. And they only got them because people kept saying they wanted to call them, but they were resistant to that technology. And when machines came along, they were also the last ones to install fax machines because their customers, their clients kept saying, we want to fax you this paper. We don't want to have to mail it. We don't want to have to drive over with it, whatever. We want to put it on our fax machine and send it to you. So by the time PCs were being introduced, there was a whole generation of attorneys who were in exactly that situation. They were hoping to retire before they ever had to touch a computer. That was their life.
I think that's still the case now. Like the attorneys I've interacted with, same way. Like it's just maybe just a different way your brain works. And man, I kind of wish my brain worked that way. They make a lot more money. But yeah, just the adoption of technology among attorneys. You're right. That's totally the laggard profession among it. And it's usually someone else who does it, right? It's not the attorneys themselves.
That's right.
They then have staff that takes care of the technology side. That's interesting.
Absolutely.
What about coming back to the planning part? So we were talking about, I'll put it this way, like helping an organization to spend an uncomfortable amount of time in the planning process. Of course, there's so many different tools out there now, software tools, how to take notes, in different ways and how to structure those notes. And especially with working more and more virtually, I think no matter what software you use, you're at a disadvantage than being in the same room on a whiteboard.
Yep.
But, in general, I've actually got this quote on my wall. Another one brought to me by Ed Kless. Thank you, Ed. From Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he, think about Dwight D. Eisenhower as not just a president, but as the person who ran the D-Day invasion.
Yes.
Maybe the most complicated project management endeavor of the 21st century, right?
20th century. Yeah.
20th century, sorry. Thank you. And anyways, he says, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And so coming back to, that late 20s consultant who's just trying to keep their head above water, and let's say the organization buys off on spending more time in planning, what does that look like to you in this 2024 world of working virtually? What's important to you? Like, is it taking notes? Is it having visuals that communicate because a picture is worth 1,000 words? Or is it just, to this quote's point, do the plans even matter? Do the documents you produce matter? Or is it more just about being in the process and what are the key points of that process? I don't know if that makes sense, but the planning process in general, how would you approach it today in 2024, especially working virtually?
Well, I have to confess that I pretty much escaped ever having to do a full implementation virtually, and I got out of the business before that was really becoming an imperative. There was a lot of follow-up work done virtually, so I have to confess I don't have a lot of experience in that realm, but I can relate something to you. After within about 2 months after I retired, I got a call from a recruiter, and there was a company. If I mentioned their name, you'd recognize it, in Southern California, that desperately wanted somebody with my experience, and it was a company that was backed by big investors from the Silicon Valley um, type investors, names that like Bill Gates and others had money in the organization, and and they I actually had 3 interviews with 3 different people in that organization, considering whether I was going to take the job, and they were going to allow me to. I said, I'm not moving to Southern California, so if I go to work for you, I'm willing to travel out there, maybe even 2 or 3 times a month, to spend a few days with you, but I'm not going to be moving out there at this stage of my life. And they said, okay, well, we really wanted somebody on site, but it sounds like you'd still be able to help us. And as long as you're willing to travel out here, that's fine. Um, and, and I had 3 interviews with them. And, and then I got to thinking about it. I said, I like to get up early in the morning. I like to go to bed at a reasonable time at night. And I could tell that these people that were in management in this organization were working 14 and 16 hours a day. And since they were in the California time zone, that means I'm going to be still answering their phone calls at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night in my time zone. And I said, that is not a life I want, even as part of my semi-retirement. So I turned it down, and I ended up having 3 more phone calls with them after I told them I wasn't going to take the job. And they really, they were making almost irresistible offers to me. But the lady said something to me that was interesting. One of the managers, she said, "We really want you because none of the other people that we've interviewed asked the question that you asked." And I said, "Well, what was that?" She said, "You asked where the landmines were." In other words, I asked, where are the crucial points of failure that you see as you move forward with this project that you will know more about than I will know, and yet you may not have disclosed everything you know because it's a sore point in the organization. So I mention that story because I think that's the consultant's first responsibility stepping into an organization, is to discover where the landmines are. What are the crucial points that are required for success, but they keep stumbling over them because unless you understand them, you cannot construct processes around the new implementation that are going to be effective if you don't have a handle on those critical facets of the organization.
I love that. Coming back to the planning process in general, I'm curious if you agree with this, but I feel like that's part of why the organization struggles to spend an uncomfortable amount of time in the planning process, because they're uncomfortable paying you to learn about them. They want their focus to immediately be on the software. And yet, to do that right, you need to put the spotlight on their organization. And to them, it's a total waste of money. Why am I paying to educate you? Do you feel like that's part of what's going on there?
Yes, that's part of it. But there's another important part. Many times these areas are so sensitive that the organization itself doesn't like to talk about them because it raises animosities between departments or even between individuals if these points are brought up and discussed in an open way. And so the organization is already struggling internally with these issues and how to deal with them just within their own selves. To then expose some newcomer outside the organization, admit that, this is a real problem in our organization and we don't even have a solution for it. It is is very challenging. It's psychologically uncomfortable for the organization to address these issues.
So I hear two pieces. One is identifying them, and then two is addressing them.
Yes.
So you've already confessed that you haven't had to run a full implementation virtually before. So let's just go theoretical. What do you think you would do in that situation? And maybe you do have at your disposal one trip in the budget. You can get out there. I'm talking mid-market companies here, right? Maybe doing
Yeah.
50 million a year, so not huge budgets, but maybe you have one trip. A lot of people go on site for go live, although it's typically pretty uneventful. But how would you deploy that trip, and how would you approach that planning process, trying to do those two things: identify the issues and address the issues and implement the software?
Well, I guess I guess the real question is, am I working for myself or am I working for an employer that is saying I have to take this job? Because if they are going to make me work remote and I'm working for myself, I would probably tell them openly, look, there is too much missed in the communications when you can be sitting in a room with people face to face, and somebody makes a comment, and you can see two other people in the organization wince or grin or make some expression that says there's something more to what's being said there than what was said, and it's up to you to uncover that. But you will never see those things if you're working remotely and having Zoom meetings with them. So those things will remain hidden, and I'll just explain to them, yeah, I could do this remotely, but there is a huge risk of failure. Maybe not a failure that is catastrophic, that you'll never get it implemented, but that it'll be a poorer quality implementation for which you will pay for the rest of the life of this software, simply because things are missed. So if you want it done right and you want it done in a first-class way, there needs to be significant face-to-face time if we're going to understand the needs of the organization in a thorough way.
I love it. So let's throw the virtual part out. How would you, let's say you're working for yourself here in 2024, and let's remove the time zone thing, which I just love how you identified that, just so practically. I like to get up early, go to bed at a reasonable hour, so this California thing's not going to work. I just love that. You identified the issue, right? So let's remove that out of the equation. Let's say it's right. You're in the Minneapolis, Minnesota area, right?
Yeah.
So let's say it's right in your backyard, and well, no, let's make it a little more challenging. We got to put some budget in there. Let's put it. I'm looking at a map right now. Let's put it like in Chicago, so not too far, but maybe it's a flight, maybe it's a drive. I don't know.
Right.
But how would you then approach the planning? Would you how would you divvy up some in person versus virtual work? Is it like for every hour of meetings, there's 2 hours of digestion and documentation? Would you meet with people individually? Would you do it in a group? How would you approach that for, let's say, a $50 million company who doesn't have a huge budget, but you're making the case that you want a first-class implementation?
Well, I would probably tell them I want to spend at least the first 2 weeks on site, and I want to meet. I want to be able to walk through the whole organization. When I walk through an organization, I generally tell them I want to start at the end of the process. Whatever, if they're shipping, if they're providing a service, whatever it is, I want to start at that end of the process and meet the people that are executing it and watch what they're doing, and work backwards to executive management to understand how the organization works. So I'm going to spend several days, depending on how complex the organization is. I'm going to spend, 2 or 3 days at least just trying to understand the organization from the customer door to executive management. And then I'm going to take some time, and I probably do it still while I'm there, in my hotel room at night or whatever. I would spend some time digesting that and putting together a presentation so that I can say, here's what I see about how your organization operates. Tell me what I'm missing, or where you disagree with my assessment of it. So that's going to be probably a full day's meeting with at least top and middle management. So I think the first 2 weeks on site is probably an imperative to get a good handle on the organization and how it operates. How that would break down, of course, would depend on so many factors, but I think 2 weeks is a reasonable expectation. But fortunately, that can be done one trip. The expensive part is just the hotel, right? After that, I'd say I won't make a commitment to limit.
Can I ask you that before
sure.
you do the after part? So, and I'm going to use this as a segue later, cleverly, to talk about supply chain. But let's say specifically this is for a $50 million distribution company. So maybe they have. I wish I had seen more organizations. This number should pop out at me, but I don't know, $50 million in revenue, but pure distribution. With not huge margins, you might be looking at a 50 to 60 person organization.
Right.
So if we take that, is it you're still suggesting 2 weeks on site?
Well, I would say allow 2 weeks. Maybe you can get it done in less than that.
I love it. Okay.
You might be able to do it in less than that, in which case they can save some money on hotel and you can go home early. Especially since, well.
But you book it, like you set that expectation, and then if you finish up earlier, great.
Yeah,
but
they're happier, right?
You're not setting a 1 day expectation. You're setting a 2 week expectation, and then you adjust as needed.
Yes.
Okay, love it. Okay, sorry. So then you said, and then sorry, there was another point I wanted to highlight there. You said you would spend some time digesting it in your hotel room at night, and what I caught there is you said you'd spend time putting together a presentation.
Yes.
It sounds like you're not necessarily spending a ton of time documenting details and getting lost in details. You're going right to presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. I don't feel, and this is just me, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like writing out a lot of documentation of step-by-step details shouldn't be my job. And that my job is to understand the flow in the organization. So when I put together a presentation, the chances are that presentation, and most of the time it was a logic flow of how the organization worked and identifying the stumbling blocks or the inhibitors to organizational flow, so that I can figure out how we can augment those the systems around those stumbling blocks in order to improve flow in the organization. Because if all I do is replicate what's already going wrong in the organization in the new software, they haven't gained anything, or they've gained very little.
I love that, because I've made this mistake before, like going on site, sitting in a conference room, and I'm taking a ton of notes. I'm getting every detail down that's being said, but I can feel it. The tactical side of my brain is engaged. The strategic side of my brain is not engaged. And I just love that practical point of you just go right to producing presentation. not to producing or capturing every detail that was talked about, because that's not your role as a consultant. Your role is to, and I think part of the reason why I've made that mistake is, especially if you're that late 20s, less experienced person, you're not sure what's important. So you're just trying to get everything, right?
Yep.
And you're not really sure how to highlight. And so you're just trying to capture everything. And you think that the number of pages that you produce is the value, but that's not the value. And so, when you're talking about the presentation, maybe give us a general ballpark of, is this a 5-slide PowerPoint deck? Is it a 10-slide? What's kind of a general thing that you'd be coming back with after those 2 weeks on site?
Um, well, I'm generally going to come back with an effects-based planning map of the organization, which doesn't map necessarily the processes, but the cause and effect of what's happening within the organization. And that gives me an opportunity to say, when this department does this, here's the effect it has on this department. But since those departments don't communicate on a regular basis, or maybe it's one of those things that the things that gets identified as a sore point in the organization. This department does this, and they've always done this, and this department over here always ignores what they do because it doesn't work with the processes that they've established in that department. And so there's always animosity between these two departments. How are we going to reconcile that? If we don't reconcile those things in the conference room and figure out how we can, maybe Department A shouldn't even be doing what they're doing because it's not being used over here anyway, and it's no benefit. And in fact, they're working around it, even though executive management insists that Department A always do this process. It's actually useless. And I can give you a perfect example. Many companies using traditional MRP systems, and I've had this conversation in multiple manufacturing facilities. The executive management went out and spent big money on an MRP system. So they insist that the planning department run MRP, every week or however often they run it. But they have to run it, and they have to send that schedule down to the shop floor, and the shop floor ignores that schedule because it didn't work from day one when they first started producing those reports, and it has never worked because changes that occurred between when they sent the information up on which the MRP plan was put together and when it comes back down as a finished plan have caused problems, and it takes too long to correct those things. So they still run the shop floor by the seat of their pants, meeting exigencies as they come up, whatever needs to be done, and they never pay attention to the MRP schedule that's produced. Well, why are we paying the planning department to do what the recipient of that report will never use because it's simply useless to them?
And you're just highlighting it at that point. You're just highlighting it,
yes,
and putting it front and center in a sense.
But it's an irritant to everybody in that organization. Chances are everybody already knows. Executive management knows the MRP system isn't giving them the results that they wanted, right? But they insist that it be used because they invested $1 million in that software.
Sure, sure.
You are going to use this because we spent the money. Well, that is literally throwing good money after bad. Because if nobody's using that report, why are they paying people to produce it?
Sure.
Right? but it's a pride thing. We spent the money. We can't admit defeat. We're gonna, but you're not going to improve that organization. And MRP is just one example, but it could be anything, any number of things. I can't think of any other particular examples that I came across, but it happens all the time. There are organizations that produce reports that get ignored in other parts of the organization, or the only people that see them are executives, and they take no action on them because they're just, the report is simply evidence of how poorly things are going. They're not really, they don't have any plan for making improvements, but they get this report all the time as evidence of how poorly things are going, so that maybe they can go down and complain once in a while. But nothing is happening with regard to improvement. All of those things are sore points in the organization. Management doesn't want to admit it. The department that is producing the report doesn't want to stop producing the report because they're afraid somebody's going to get laid off if they're told to stop producing it. The rest of the organization sees it as waste, but they can't do anything about it because the executive management is endorsing it. Those kinds of things go on all the time. But if you haven't been on site as a consultant to build rapport with these people, if you tell them that in a Zoom meeting, they'll hang up and you'll never hear from them again.
Yeah, it's a great point. I completely agree. Going back to the presentation part, you said effects-based planning. So I just did a quick Google. I'd never heard that before. Do you have any like recommended books or material for learning more about that? I think you were describing as a presentation style or as a something that you're going for. Do you have any resources you could recommend?
Sure. Almost any of the books about theory of constraints any of the better books about theory of constraints or constraint-based planning would give you good information about that. Effects-based planning simply says you have to identify the organizational goals, but you begin by mapping out all of the steps. That's why I start at the bottom, start at the end of the chain of events when they're shipping or when they're on the customer side or whatever they're doing, to try to figure out what are the steps that get us to this point. Because if the goal of the organization is, to improve and make more money, which I hope is what the goal is, if you haven't identified the undesirable effects, and what we were just talking about is an undesirable effect. It's an undesirable effect for one organization or one part of the organization to be producing a report that, on the one hand, management ignores because they know, even if they've never admitted it openly, that it's ineffective in the organization, and for the other part of the organization to receive this report under the theory that it's going to have some effect on how they execute, but they actually don't execute anything based on that information. It's all based on something else. It is an undesirable effect because it's costing that organization money to produce and maintain that report, and it's reaping no benefit for having done that. In fact, it often becomes, as I said, an irritant within the organization. There's animosity building between the departments or whatever. Those are undesirable effects. And the goal of the consultant in the ERP implementation should be to identify these undesirable effects and help the organization as they move into the new software solution not simply automate bad effects. Um, they should they should eliminate the bad effects, because there is more to be gained by helping the organization move in that direction than there is to simply automate the bad things they're already doing.
I'll do a little research, uh, looking for a theory of constraints, effects-based planning, and I'll run it by you before I put it on the episode links at augforums.com/episode 141.
Oh, sure.
Just so maybe we could pare it down to one book that would be a good, because I myself would like to read more about that, just as a way to present what you found. And I think it's also really just a great practical point to say that you start at the end and you work your way backwards, because I think that a lot of consultants start with accounting,
Yeah.
because it's like they're like, oh, this will be the easiest one, and then the first thing you're talking about is the general ledger, and it becomes a mess because you realize you really need to understand everything else, understand how you're going to structure the general ledger. And so I just think that's a great practical point. Start at the end, work your way back, which I would assume would be accounting is last for you. Is that right?
Actually, accounting is sort of next to last. The last is executive management. Um, so, um, yeah, I always end with executive management, to see how how they are viewing the organization, and what their approach is to dealing with some of the things that I may have uncovered. Were they aware of them? Were they not aware of them? Are they? Um, because unfortunately, especially in the United States, of course, I confess I haven't any experience in actually working in other countries, but I've read a lot. And um, one of the things that in the uh, Toyota's management approach is that they their executives always believe that nobody knows more about the machine than the man who runs the machine. And by that, they mean if you want to know what's going to improve the organization, you got to go down to where the work is being done and learn from the people who are doing the work. You can't sit up in your office and tell the people down there how they should do the work. Um, and as a result, um, you know, many American companies have now done some improvement based on having to meet the challenges. But Toyota's management was able to, just listening to the people who ran the machines, were able over about a 40-year period to, just as one example, they had machines in the plant where changeover from one model car to another model sometimes took 2 days for the changeover on that one machine. But over the years, incrementally, over a period of 20 or 30 years, they went from redesigning those machines and the processes so that the changeovers on those machines went from 2 days to less than 2 hours to change between models. It didn't happen in one. It took maybe 100 steps to get there, but each time the people who ran the machine says, if we did this, we could do that, right? We need to learn from the people in the organization if we're going to make any effective management changes. So that's my goal, is to learn from the people in the organization as I walk through the organization, learn the challenges that they face, try to uncover, like I said, the landmines, what are the critical things, try try to uncover any kinds of latent feelings or animosity between departments or even sometimes between individuals that's affecting the performance. Because if I'm going to really help that organization improve, simply automating all the bad stuff that's already going on is not going to do it. And they'll have a new system, but things will not be much different than it was before.
I knew this was going to happen. I'm already over on the time that I had booked, so I want to check. I can go until 11:30 Central Time, then I have another call. Are you okay to go another 20 minutes or so, or should we
Yeah,
wrap
I
up
can
in
go.
a few
Yeah, I
minutes?
can go a few more minutes.
You could? All right, perfect. I was thinking to pivot to supply chain at some point, but um, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's perfectly fine. Um, there's a couple things you said in there. So, um, first off, when you're talking about upper level management being last, is that the presentation that you give, or is the presentation after that?
Say that question again.
So we talked about accounting being next to last
Uh-huh.
in your 2 week on site. Then you talked about upper level management being last. Is that the presentation that you give, that effects-based planning theory of constraints presentation? Or is that still gathering intel for the presentation that you give later?
No, it's still gathering information. Uh, I, I want to make that presentation to the whole management team, hopefully, not just to executive management. Sometimes they'll insist to have a preview of it, which is fine. I'll go over it with them. But I can tell you, I've done ERP implementations in companies. Of course, most of those people are themselves retiring now. But I've come back to organizations 20 years after I've uh, helped them with an implementation, and had members of management tell me they'll go to their file cabinet, they'll pull out, I still have that effects-based planning map that you gave me, and I look at it to help our organization improve.
That's great validation right there, right? I
Yeah.
love that. That's awesome. So that presentation comes later, and so let's say it is a full 2 weeks. You're out there, you work your way through the departments. You're talking to the people who do the work, which is the Toyota approach, and you also then talk to upper level management, still in a way of gathering information, not reporting back things and trying to troubleshoot things. Then do you come back on site later? Do you give that presentation virtually? Where do you go from there?
Well, it would be preferable to do it on site. If they insist, we can do it remotely, but I always prefer to do it on site. And the reason for that, remember what I said about picking up hints from people's looks and reactions when things are said
Right,
in the
right.
room. It's nice to be able to visibly see how various especially middle managers respond, especially when we talk about some of the more sensitive areas that appear to be potential landmines in the process. It'll give you a hint about what kind of cooperation or resistance you might have to deal with in the coming days of the implementation process.
So, at the end of that, you still haven't even, in a sense, shown any software screens, really. I mean, you're gathering a lot of intel, but you haven't done anything with the software yet. So let's say you then go give that presentation back on site again. Um, at what point and then how do you turn the corner into the software side of things?
Well, as part of, I mean, while I'm preparing that presentation, I'm already thinking in the back of my mind about how this will affect the configurations of the software and how it'll be used in the organization. So the next step is to discuss with them some of these concepts and maybe show them some screens that are going to have an effect on some of these uh, critical areas that will hopefully lead to improvement. And hopefully, and I'll be real honest with you at this point, hopefully you've had the consultant has had some input during the sales cycle. Because the worst possible scenario, and I've been there too many times, is that the salespeople went down and based on things that they did, I mean, they don't know. A lot of times the salespeople simply, uh, they believe the sales literature, even if they wrote it themselves. Um, and uh, they will have told them things about the effects of modules that are simply not going to happen. Again, the most common one that I ran into is having a sales guy go in and say, "Well, we sold." I'm going to refer to the Sage products. We sold the Sage MRP module, whether it was the Sage 500 or one of the other Sage products. And they sold them an MRP module, and we told them it's gonna help them with their manufacturing process and bring big improvements. Well, almost since the invention of MRP, most people have who know anything about manufacturing have realized that you have to know thousands of accurate details about your manufacturing process to be entered as variables into the MRP system if it's going to produce anything near accurate. And it's information that most people in the manufacturing operations do not know, like even reasonably precise cycle times for many of their operations, or wait times, or setup times, or they just don't know these numbers. And even if they know them, the chances of producing, with some reasonable accuracy, the chances of results that can actually be used to drive their manufacturing process are pretty slim. So when we're talking about improvements, one of the things that I always hope for is for some involvement in the sales process, because I don't want to sell them modules that are not going to be helpful, or miss modules that they should have had that they don't have, or tell them things that are not necessarily true in every case about the application of a module.
I'm laughing out loud, but with my microphone muted as you're describing that, because I've been in that same situation. And I think it just underscores the importance of the question you asked originally, which was, in this situation, am I working for myself or am I working for a company that's telling me to work on this project? Because, yeah, so much of that happens when you're setting expectations in the sales process. And even this whole idea of doing a 2-week on site is totally counter to so much of the marketing that gets pushed out by ERP publishers, because that is so much along the lines of cookie cutter implementations, best practices, these terms that are designed to get people to buy the software as quickly as possible.
Right.
And then you as the consultant are stuck with, how do we go live in a month or something like that, right?
Right.
And you can find those situations, but you're not affecting major change. You're essentially replacing hardware, or you're replacing a UI with a better looking UI, but you're not affecting major change in the organization. So I just love that you bring that up, because that's so important. If you're really going to get involved in one of these projects where you make the organization better with an ERP implementation, rather than just, as you've said, automating the things that they've already done.
Yeah, I never saw it as my responsibility as a consultant to simply come in and automate bad processes. If you do stupid things faster, it doesn't really help the organization.
Agreed. But I love that you still outline an approach, to like oh, I just blanked on what you called it, a first class ERP implementation, right? And
Yeah.
Implementing, because in a sense, I don't know if you agree with this, but I feel like when you outline this type of approach, you're almost using the ERP implementation just as an excuse to do a lot of business consulting that could take place outside of an ERP implementation. And a lot of companies could probably achieve 80% of the benefits by re-implementing the same ERP software that they're already using. Would you agree with that this is really more about the business than about the software? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I absolutely agree that in most cases, the solution in terms of the software and hardware is less important than the implementation, because ERP system sales are based on improving you're gonna reap the benefits for years to come of doing this. And while that might be true if you're taking an organization that's currently using pencils and paper or whatever, or they're currently they don't have modules that will actually drive improvement, and you're going to supply them with new modules that are specifically designed and engineered to drive improvement, not to drive just data collection. But for most organizations, the real improvement comes with taking a step back and figuring out how their organization works. And no new software is required to find dramatic improvements.
I love hearing someone with your level of experience say that, because I feel like I've sort of bumped into that with less experience, and it's nice to hear you put it that way. And I think that's what I was trying to get at when I said that most of the challenges are people and not the software. It's not really the people. It's just that, yeah, that's a better way of putting it. It's the implementation of the software more important than it is the software itself. And the challenges you run into are typically less about the software and more about how you decided to configure it, how you understood things. And I guess that's what I mean by people problems, because they were decisions that you made, right? Not necessarily bugs or whatever in the software itself. And I've said this to people, like, if you have a choice between great implementation partner and not as great software, or not as great implementation partner with better software, if you really knew that's what you were choosing between, it's hard to know that. But I would go with better implementation partner and not as good software for the points that you've already made. I mean, would you agree?
Yes, I absolutely agree. But I can tell you that software salesmen tend to be, I'm going to put this word in quotes, good at their job, if their job is to sell software. They are not necessarily good at their job in telling the truth about what will actually produce improvement in the organizations. because most of them have no idea.
Yeah, we're kind of sitting up here, ivory tower, talking about how we want the world to work, but in reality, the world doesn't work that way, right? And that's why, to me, in a sense, the ERP implementation is just the excuse to back into a lot of these things. Ideally, I know the sale has to be made, and um, it's just the way the world works, right?
Right. Yeah.
I wish it didn't, but yeah, that's just the way it goes. Well, Richard, I think I got about 10 minutes left. Thank you for going over, by the way, and thank you for taking the time. I'd love to get into supply chain and all sorts of other things, but just for the sake of time, I thought I'd kind of wrap it up. Um, first asking you what you're up to these days. So you've got semi-retired on your LinkedIn profile. What does that mean for you?
Well, uh, I kind of ended up doing what I'm doing through a back door. Um, when I when I retired from full time work, which I did primarily because I'm getting older, and I was actually getting to the age where my I hate to admit this, my mind wasn't working as good as it did in years past, and I didn't want to be that guy who did something stupid that cost one of our clients tens of thousands of dollars. So I said, well, I'm just going to play it safe. Gonna I'm going to quit before I make any big mistake. Um, so then I I had this vision of, well, I'll do a little occasional consulting, independently. And I beat my head against the wall for about 6 or 8 months trying to drum up a little business. I mean, I did a little, but it wasn't really significant. And I was spending an excessive amount of time just trying to get the little business I did get. And so then my daughter came to me, one of my daughters, and came to me and said, "Dad, uh, could you build this planter for me for my yard?" And I said, "Sure, I can build that for you." And I built it, and then after I put it together, I said, I bet I could sell a few of these. So I put in a little ad, and I sold a few of the planters, and then people started asking me to, build other things for them, other various things for their yards and gardens, and some that led to some deck renovations, and that led to some work, interior, trim work and stuff like that. And almost without any effort at all, I ended up being in the construction, in the carpentry business. So I said, well, I'm not going to fight the flow. If this is where the Lord's taking me, I'm happy to do this. So that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing.
That's really cool. Two examples come to mind. One is it sounds like you avoided the Michael Jordan problem. Michael Jordan just couldn't hang it up and ended his career getting destroyed on the court by younger basketball players. So you avoided that. You knew when to hang it up. And then secondly, I think of Sherlock Holmes. I used to enjoy listening to old radio recordings from the
Oh
1930s,
yeah, me too.
1940s. And I listened to all the Sherlock Holmes ones that are available. A lot of them got lost during the war, but I just really like that. There's actually a lot of good consulting lessons, I feel like, in there. He called himself a consulting detective.
Yep.
And, with your approach to consulting, I think it's really cool that you've now doing carpentry, because it makes me think of Sherlock Holmes retiring and doing bee farming, something totally unrelated, but more tactile. And I just think that's really cool. And maybe I'll do the same thing, when I semi-retire. That's really awesome. Um, and then, lastly, just to wrap it up in the last few minutes, for those of you who um, are not God people, I'm not proselytizing here, but I would, so you can end the episode here if you'd like, but Richard, I think I'd totally not do this episode justice if I didn't describe what this is the first time we've ever talked on this
Right.
episode, right?
Yeah.
We've exchanged some emails, we've exchanged some LinkedIn messages. I saw your stuff. I can't even remember when it first was. Like, I think it was back when I was working with Sage 500, because the last product I think that you got really deep into was Sage 500, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's correct. Yeah.
And so I don't know. I tend to gravitate towards substance. I have a pretty low tolerance for marketing fluff, and I just gravitate towards substance. And I can't even remember where it was. I think you might have had a blog at one point or somewhere where I just found a lot of good substantive posts from you, and that's a lot of it was around that supply chain thing that we didn't get to.
Right.
But anyways, I think I had first learned of you in that space, and then even now that I'm in the Acumatica space, I had mentioned your name to someone in the Acumatica space at one point. Can't remember who it was, but I love their nickname for you. He's like, oh yeah, Richard. We called him the Professor. Well-read, thoughtful, that, and anyway, so I've heard of you from that angle, but then on LinkedIn, I was really confused when I first saw you posting on LinkedIn about this Bible, with footnotes, like a translation. There's so many translations out there, but one called the Recovery Version, which
Yeah.
is not about like recovering from alcohol or anything like that. It's more about recovering a lot of the truths that were lost through the centuries.
Yes.
And when I saw you posting about that particular version, I myself, have read that version and really like it, and really like how it really highlights a lot of the life aspects of being a Christian. And
Yes.
I myself describe myself as a Christian, but not a religious Christian, in the sense that I love the Lord Jesus, and um, I, to me, there's a difference that you can be very religious and just kind of, the Christian life to you is in your head and not anything more than that.
Right.
But anyways, I like that version. And when I saw you posting on LinkedIn about that, I was like, what? This is this the same person as the same 500? And so that connection was just tickled me so much. And it's still amazing to me that this is the first time we're talking. I'd love to get out to Minnesota and meet you in person, but I just want to thank you for posting about that. And any thoughts you'd like to share on just your Christian life in general.
Yeah. May the Lord save us from religion. He came that we would have life, and have life abundantly, not that we would have good doctrine.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Yeah. I'll just leave it at that. I wanted to acknowledge that connection, and just would love to meet you in person and talk more about that. So there's definitely that connection too, but also on the ERP side, I love all the stuff you shared on this episode, and I really appreciate it, and I really hope that it's especially useful to a younger consultant. It's interesting to me, the turnover right now is not so much about the software. You could call it a transition to cloud ERP now. That's what the marketing will say.
Right.
I think the bigger transition right now is generational, right? With so many baby boomers retiring and so much knowledge being lost, there's a big overhaul happening, especially in the United States. And so you just have a lot of wet behind the ears, greener consultants, right? And so thank you for taking the time to attempt in 90 minutes to reflect on your career. And, I'm sure there's a ton of nuggets in there that people will find useful. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Amen. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's it for now. We'll catch you on the next episode of ogforums.com Real Talk. Thanks for listening, and take care.